All right. Well, today on the show, we are excited to talk to Mitchel Lee. Mitchell, how are you today?
I am so excited to be here with you and the whole Churchology tribe. So thanks for having me on here, Mark.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Now, Mitchell is about to release a brand new book called Even If. We're going to dive into it today. But before we dive in, Mitchell, would you just introduce yourself to us? Tell us a little bit about your story.
Yeah, so I'm a second generation Korean American. My parents immigrated to the United States in 1974 with the whole American dream and made a life for me and my sister. And so I was born here, raised here in the state of Maryland. I went to the University of Maryland College Park. Go Terps.
Hmm.
I went to seminary at Southeastern. I did some grad school at Wheaton. So I've been kind of all over the place. I say that I became an adult in Chicago, Illinois, because after right as I got married, and then we moved out to Chicago to be part of a church in the western suburbs, and they just loved us and really made me want to be the kind of pastor that they deserved as a church.
Hmm.
And right now, I'm back in Maryland. So I've been here 9 years, just south of Baltimore, kind of in between Baltimore and DC, and the lead pastor of a multi ethnic church called Grace Community Church. And the church is about 37 years old. I've been here just about 9 years. Mhm.
Oh, cool.
Yep. I've got one wife. Her name's Sarah, and I've got five children. So my quiver is full. And it's
There you go.
Calvin, Noah, Ben, Beatrice, and Owen. So four boys and a girl in
That's
that.
great. That's great. And so, like we said, the book is called Even If. Now, I would love to hear the story. There's always a story for where a book comes from. And so where did this come from for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably been more than so. It was right around when I was graduating seminary in 2002. So the message has been marinating in me for about 19 years, and I wish I could say it came on a mountaintop, but really it was a message that God met me with in the valley. I was in that kind of wilderness period. I was graduating seminary, and you're wide-eyed, right, Mark? And you got all these young pastor dreams of how you're going to go change the world, and
Oh, yeah.
they charge you up right at commencement. They're like, you're going to go out and change the world for the Lord and advance his kingdom. And I thought all those things. And literally like a week before graduation, I got fired from my church, the
Wow.
home church, more than 20 years. I grew up in that church. I was the youth pastor there and had really just given my life to the church even before I was the youth pastor. And they fired me. There was a
Mm.
rumor that I was going to go on to do further studies, and so the senior pastor hired my replacement before asking me. And so when we had that awkward conversation, I mean, he was like, "Oh, your replacement's coming in June." And so, you can stay till end of July, I guess. And man, that just was the beginning of a series of kind of expulsions into the wilderness. But
Mm.
finally, at the end of this whole thing, I mean, I'm thinking that it can't get any lower, right? And then finally, I found myself a year and a half later, I'm managing my mom's deli, Mark. And I'm thinking to myself, how did I get here? I mean, I had all these dreams. I was supposed to be this like pastor who was going to fulfill so much potential. And here I was. I didn't even want to open my Bible, honestly. And I found myself like, I hadn't abandoned faith in God. I had just learned to kind of massage it so that to keep God at a distance
Oh,
so I
wow.
could
Yeah.
see if it's possible, right? And it was in the midst of that when I stumbled upon Daniel 3. And man, the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they're before this fire. They refuse to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's statue. Nebuchadnezzar offers this threat. He says, "Look, if you bow, then all is good." And their response just captivated me. They said, "Well, King, our God can save us from the fire, but even if he doesn't,
Mm.
right? Even if he doesn't do what we know he could do, we're not worshiping any other God." And man, that was just kind of the seed bed of resolve and who is God, and what is my relationship with him, what's it based on. And that's where the message was really born in that wilderness period.
Wow. Wow. What a story. So when that happened to you, just to revisit that moment when that happened, and like you said, the church had already things were already in motion. They'd already hired the replacement. You find out after the fact. What are some of the things that you're feeling? What's happening inside of you when all this is coming out?
Right, yeah, you're feeling betrayal, you're
Mm.
feeling like, what did I do, how could this happen? And then of course you're like, at that point, I could look back and I could say, man, I should have looked, hey, what's going on in my heart, right? Like, and self-reflection. I wasn't doing any of that. I had just been punched in the gut, right? So you're just keeled over, and you're feeling all this woundedness. And it
Mm.
gets even deep. I mean, I said it even gets, the valley gets lower because I jumped to another church in a place of unhealth. I had not reflected through the pain of what had happened, and not even beyond the why, but like just really what had happened. And so I took another church position just for the paycheck, right? I
Wow.
needed another gig,
Yeah.
and I was in a place of spiritual unhealth. And guess what? A year after I joined that church, I get fired again. So man, I can
Mm.
boast. I got 2 firings in a period of about 2.5 years, and none of them for a moral failure,
Wow.
right? It's
Oh
just
my
punching the
goodness.
gut and not getting back up. And I do remember also just kind of looking down and seeing so many other colleagues, pastors of my generation, who they were leaving the ministry too.
Hmm.
And it wasn't, again, it wasn't because of moral failures or disqualification. They just gotten punched in the gut and they're like, this isn't quite worth it. I'm going to go do something else. I thought that was going to be my lot. And the Lord restored me. Mhm.
Yeah. And so God meets you right there in that passage in Daniel, that famous passage, even if. And so what is that? How did that passage speak to you in that moment? What is it that God just revealed to you in that passage that brought you to where you are today with the book?
Yeah. So there's really two parts to that declaration, right? The first is their confidence in God's ability to save. They have a confidence in his goodness. And then they have this resolve to worship him, even if he doesn't act the way that they think he should. And if you think about it, if you really unpack that, the story of how even Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego got there in the first place, right? Like sometimes we read the scriptures and it's kind of sanitized, right? Where we're like,
Mm.
oh, of course they're going to say something like that. And, that's why they're in the text, right? Think about like how they got there, right? So if you just I mean, Daniel and his three friends, they were promising youth in Jerusalem, right? The time of Jeremiah is this prophet who's saying, hey, people of God, you need to return back to the Lord. And all these other prophets are telling him, nah, Jeremiah doesn't know what he's talking about. This is the city of God. God's never going to hand over Jerusalem. And finally, God hands over Jerusalem to Babylon, right? And so Babylon comes in, they siege the city, tear it down, and then they literally, I mean, traffic all the promising youth to Babylon. And there's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? So for them to have this confidence in God's goodness, I'm like, where's that coming from? Because in their life experience, right, they were in Jerusalem, they were the city of God, and it had been handed over. Like, really, God is able to save them when He couldn't do it for their city? Yet they have this confidence in his goodness. And then that leads to this resolve to say, so we're going to worship him even if he doesn't do according to our will. uh, and then, man, when you see that there, you ever have that experience, like when you want to, maybe you're thinking about buying a car, or you talk about some subject and suddenly when you're driving you see that car like everywhere, right? Like
Mm.
suddenly it's just everywhere in the road because your mind is attuned to it. I began to see this everywhere in the scriptures, this sort of even if confidence plus resolve, for so many saints, so many biblical heroes, uh, that just constantly their declaration.
Yeah. And
Mhm.
so what was that for you? You said those words. You said them again just now. I actually wrote them down when you said them: confidence and resolve.
Mhm.
And so, what was that? What was that resolve aspect for you? You talk about resolutions in the book, and even if is an even if resolution. But what is that declaration resolute? What was that for you?
Man, the heart, it was, I remember where I was on the floor on my knees crying to the Lord and with trembling lips, Mark, saying, even if I never pastor a church again, I'm going to worship you.
Hmm.
Even if I do not fulfill the potential of all these people in the church growing up telling me, oh, God's going to use you, God's got a wonderful plan for you, and all, even if my life is destined to manage my mom's deli in obscurity, I'm going to worship you because you're worthy, God. You're worthy of my worship. Regardless of the benefits it gives to me, you're worthy of my worship. That was my first even if declaration. I've since come to realize that it's not quite one banner you raise. It's really just you draw a thread through a tapestry of an even if declaration for your life. There, every valley, every disappointment, every moment of nervousness, every moment of should I do this or should I do that? There's this opportunity to declare, even if your resolve to worship God, no matter what might come out of that next step that you're about to take.
Yeah.
Mm.
Man, I think just listening to your story, one of the things that really sticks out to me is, especially since that happened to you in the context of ministry. You mentioned being fired twice. So many people in that same situation, and you
Mm.
had even went to another church, like you said, for that paycheck. So many people in that situation would have just kind of shifted into a gear that said, "Listen, I'm just going to do this for the paycheck. This is what I got trained to do," and they will spend their ministry bitter and cynical, and they'll just cover it up. And what a grace that, that God just did not let you go down that path.
Yeah, and I mean, what an astute observation you're making, right? Especially as we're emerging out of this COVID,
Yeah.
and we think about our colleagues and just the carnage that it's taken on the pastorate, and just, I'm sure you have. I've got plenty of relationships with guys and who just they're not doing it anymore. They're
Yeah.
done, And this is not to throw shade on any of their character or
Oh,
any of that
totally.
stuff, but I know where they're at. Right? Like
Mhm.
there are the moments where it's like, man, do I keep doing this? Do I do not? Do I do this not? Or I like what you said there. We kind of hedge our bets, right? We make ministry safe,
Hmm.
and we and so then we don't have to say even if, right? Because we can keep it just safe enough and within our control so that ministry has the predictable results or the status quo that we want. And I think God wants more for his church. I think God wants more for not just for pastors but for Christians in the church. I think God wants more for us.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many things that stick out to me in your book, and even just listening to your story. So one of the things that really comes through a thread that's just throughout the book is just the power of our thoughts and words.
Mhm.
Especially when we think about resolutions and declarations. What is the power? I guess a better way to say it. What is the power of our thoughts and words when it comes to our faith, or these moments when life just doesn't go the way that we thought it was going to go?
Yeah, right. Well, there's two thinkers or two writers who've really helped me see the power of our thoughts. The first is, if I start chronologically, A.W. Tozer, right? His book, The Knowledge of the Holy. I don't remember much about that book at all. I just remember the first line of that book, right? And he says, to the extent he says, what comes to mind for you when you hear the word God or when you think about God is the most important thing about you, right?
Hmm.
Who God is the most important thing about you. And that's whether you're a Christian or a non-believer, atheist, what you think about God is the most important. And then second is Paul David Tripp. He says, like, who you believe you are and what resources you believe you have available to you will determine how you respond to every situation in life. Right? So
Well,
just think of that, right? Like who you believe you are. So something as simple as somebody cuts me off in traffic, right? Do you know who am I, right? I own this lane. Don't you know that, right? And then what resources you believe you have to you. Like, well, if I'm an orphan, if I believe that I'm an orphan, that I have to fend for myself and defend my own territory, I'm going to honk. I'm gonna do the explicit tirade, right? Same thing goes for parenting. Who you believe you are, what resources you believe you have. And so our thinking in this is, if we think that if we forget that we are the beloved, right? If we begin to doubt that God is good simply because of our own personal portfolio, if we forget that we have all the resources of heaven, his very spirit dwelling in us, that is going to affect how we respond to every situation, every person in life. So that's one aspect of the ways that thinking can hit us. I talk in the book, Jamie Smith, he's a philosopher out of Calvin Seminary. And Jamie Smith says that we all have a picture of the good life in
hmm.
our mind, right? That picture that we think is, we could say that's our version of paradise. Kids who always listen and behave, or a ministry that's thriving, a marriage that's flourishing, or maybe if you're single and listening to this, I have this marriage, or I have a career, a 5-year plan. Like we have these pictures of the good life, and our hearts will set towards that and be formed in that direction. Well, we can get such a hold of that picture of the good life that when it doesn't go our way, we can equate that as God's not blessing it, God's not in it. And suddenly we begin like we get these like these kind of judgments very quickly of, oh man, that didn't have the turnout, that didn't have the effect that I wanted. I'm not married by now, so therefore God must not be blessing me. And that kind of quick causal thinking, I think, can get us into a lot of trouble. It can cause disappointments to seem even bigger. It can make that valley even darker and deeper. So those are just a couple of ways. I mean, there's so many other things that we can do in terms of our thinking that affects us. Remembering, remembering who God is. You know, I hear it a lot. You know, people say like, do not fear is the most repeated command in the scriptures, and lexically, linguistically, those words, yeah, it is true. But thematically, it's actually not the most repeated theme in the scriptures in terms of command. It's remember or don't
Mm.
forget. Like God really, He knows we're prone to amnesia, right? We're prone to amnesia. I was talking about this with somebody who just got through a crazy period of life, and we just kind of stopped in a moment. We were like, hey, let's not forget how good God was to us through this last leg, because we always, the next challenge comes, we have amnesia. We forget what God did in the past for us, and we act like God has to prove himself again and again. And so, these are just some of the areas that I talk about in the book about the way that our thinking affects us. Mhm.
Yeah, because one of the things that really stuck out to me in the book is you talk about the difference between recalling and remembering,
Mm,
and
mhm.
I just felt like I felt like you were reading my mail there. I am really good at recalling, and I'm not good at remembering. And so, help us talk about that. What do you mean when you say recall, and what's the difference between that and remember?
Yeah. So, and that actually really came to me as I was writing the book, because I was thinking to myself, there is something different about this kind of theological remembrance that God is calling to versus
Mm,
what I usually do. Right? Recall is just the facts, the figures. Like, um, oh, I had this meal with that person, or another way to think about it is you could think about like your timeline events on your Facebook, right?
yeah.
Like you just throw a picture up there, and it's this sort of thing, and you forget more than you actually remember that you posted, right? You're just recalling events. And remembering is thinking about the significance of those events, how they even connect together. Um, if we were to say it in a slightly different way, that when we think about recall, we're really at the surface level of data, right? When we're at remembering, we're saying, what does that say about me? What does that say about God? What does that say about our relationship? Let's say like we recall a meal that we had together, right? We might say, oh yeah, I remember there was steak that was served, and yeah, it was a nice evening and good conversation. That's recall. And remembering takes that same data and goes one step deeper in the significance of it. Man, I remember that time that Mark and I were really able to connect around that steak. Gosh, I remember when he showed a little bit of that vulnerability, and oh man, we were able to uh, connect around that moment of intimacy together, right? There's a remembrance there. There's one step deeper, which, you know, sadly in our day and age, we have to make it a discipline to remember. Right?
Hmm.
The thing about biblically, right? God knows we're so prone to amnesia that when he calls Israel to remember, he associates it with food, right? He gives them a
That's
feast.
good.
Here's a meal I want you to have around this. And as you have the meal, I want you to not just recall, but I want you to remember the goodness of God and how he delivered you, how he saved you, how he showed his faithfulness to you. So you see these like meals that are tied to this deeper remembrance. And in our day and culture, when we're kind of the next thing, the next thing, the next thing, we don't even have time to
Hmm.
remember. We're just too busy going to the next thing, right? I mean, it's how Netflix works,
Yeah.
right? Like you watch an episode, it ends on a cliffhanger, you're like, wow, and you don't even have time to think about what just happened in the plot, because the next episode is in 5, 4, 3, 2, right? And then boom, you're on to the next one. And I just think that there's a power in remembrance, especially in our relationship with God, about who he is. So what he did, and what did that show us about who he is? That's where I make a real strong point about remembering.
Yeah, there's so many things about that. Would you agree that just when I was reading that and then listening to you describe it, it it sounds like, and maybe the reason I think that is because I think that this is what I do a lot of times. A lot of times I will stay at the level of recalling, this is what they did to me. This is what happened to me. And all that does is make me bitter. All that does is all that does is cause me to get further from God. I become somebody that I don't want to become. And so do you think that, would you say that a lot of people, even followers of Jesus, they stay at that level of recalling, and we have not learned the discipline of remembering?
Yes, I would agree, right? Because you have to actually pause to remember.
Mm,
You can't just recall by scrolling,
mm,
right?
yeah,
Remembering actually requires us to stop and
yeah,
and, and to do some reflection. And wow, what a lost art, right? Even just the practice of silence and stillness to remember. Yeah. And I love the way that, I mean, that's a very, I love the way that you took that and thought about that, like in terms of the recalling of negative things and
mm,
hurtful things in the past, and the practice of remembering that goes along with it, that keeps our hearts uh, soft,
mm,
right? Rather than hardening us. I can see it as, if I was going to go off of that thought, I could see it as like, if we just recall the negative and hurtful things that somebody or something did to us, we would easily just make almost a dossier, right? A portfolio, a case against someone by recalling, versus the remembrance of, even who is God in that. Again, going back to our thinking, who am I and what resources do I have available, allows us to, I think, maybe even think a little deeper, not just about the who God is and sort of like, washing it away, but even to think through the pain and why did it hurt so much and what did actually happen, and sort of naming what has happened. you know.
yeah. Can you walk us through maybe how you do that? How do you, just to use the words that you just now said, you literally have to stop to
Mm.
remember. So I can be in the process of recalling, and then I have to stop to remember. Can you walk us through maybe how you do that?
Yeah, so I do it on different rhythms actually. So I've never been a big journaler, but when it comes to remembering, I found that journaling is very helpful. And
Mm,
I'm not talking about like flowery journals that somebody's going to read when I die one day, and probably, I'm not talking about that. I mean, I've got like bullet points and things like that. But so I have regular practices of doing that. So if I were to say just kind of broadly, I have a month, uh, uh, like one day a month, I have a day of solitude. And I don't, sometimes I go in with an agenda, sometimes usually like actually in the morning, I will just start thinking about what is going right, what is going wrong right now. And I'll think about a lot of different levels, like church and home and personally, relationships. Just start bullet pointing some things like that. So, because you have to have the data, right? You have to
yeah,
have, you can't remember something that you don't have data for, right? So sometimes that's this practice of just naming some things, speaking some things. What am I feeling even right now? Where am I? And because those emotions will come up as I start to recall some things. And instead of, and I give myself enough time so that I don't just close it. Okay, I've recalled, I'm off. Now I will go to the next. So what does that say about God, and what is He showing me about myself? These are
yeah,
part of remembering. So that's on a monthly, but oftentimes on a weekly too. If in a morning of some silence and stillness, I'll take some time to do even smaller chunks of that. Right, even just thinking about yesterday. Um, I have a friend who actually does the practice in the evening, and she will recall the day that has just passed, and then she'll actually pay attention to the places of where, ooh, like I sense the presence of God there, and ooh, or I didn't sense the presence of God there. In fact, some other emotions come up, and she'll spend just a few moments thinking about that each evening. Now, having 5 kids, it make the evening part is a little harder for me, but this friend of mine says like that's a great practice as well too. So it
yeah,
just takes some deliberate slowing down, um, to be able to take the time to remember.
yeah.
Yeah. You can also do them on the yearly as well, right? So you
Mm,
take advantage to see the timing. right? Everybody's thinking at the end of the year and the new year resolutions and all. Well, we it's so funny. Most people I know, they'll come up with New Year's resolutions, what they want to do going forward, but they spend very little amount of time thinking about what happened in the previous year. And we try to even do that exercise with our kids as a family, and we just kind of come up with the data. And I'll take a little bit of that and spend some time saying, what did God really do, and what's He really doing, and what has He shown me?
Yeah.
Mhm.
That's just such a powerful practice. One of the things you talk about in the book, you talk about counter ifs.
Mm.
And what do you mean by that? What are counter ifs?
Well, counter ifs are they're ways of thinking that we develop, sometimes consciously, sometimes like even unintentionally. They're ways that we cope with the uncertainties of life, right?
Hmm.
We all know that that life is uncertain, but it's funny that we're always surprised when it does, right? And so we come up with ways to try to instead of saying even if, we say, okay, well, let's try to bail God out, or let's try to hedge our bets, or let's try to protect ourselves. There's tons of them, but three that I thought felt really neatly into some good categories is the first is like these conditions that we can put on God, like the only if. So it says, well, God, only if you do X, Y, Z will I do my part, or will I step forward. It's this
Hmm.
sort of like, you've got to do this, God, and this course of actions, because this is what I want. And if you don't, I'm withholding my worship, or I'm not going to move forward, or I'm going to be mad at you and disappointed forever. So that's the first kind of condition. Another kind is just the regrets of the if onlys. Um, and we could have regrets in the past of, wow, if only I could go back and be like that. If only I could have the
Hmm.
faith of my yesteryear, right? If only I could be on fire like I was way back when. If only, if only, if only. Or it's the regrets of like past mistakes stuff, right? If only I didn't do that. If only I didn't do that. And we can that counter if can just keep us stuck from moving forward, right? And again, it's a way of coping. We live in our regrets to think like, as long as I can feel as bad about my regrets as possible, then somehow I can show God I'm sorry enough, right? Worthy of forgiveness. All these anti-gospel thoughts. And the last one is just the contingencies, that our desire to control life, the what ifs. And what if this doesn't happen? And what if I step out here and if I try to talk to that person and they reject me? What if? What if? What if? What if? What if? And these contingencies, and then it causes us to go into just a number of different possible solutions, scenarios. We can get so paralyzed by the possibilities, we get stuck, right?
Yeah.
If you've ever done a Google deep dive, you know what I'm talking about, right? Where you're like, oh, I just want to research this one question, and then suddenly, 2 hours later, you've clicked on more links than you should have, and you've learned more about this simple 98% success rate surgery procedure and the 2% things that can go wrong and why I went wrong and then you get paralyzed, right?
Mm.
You get paralyzed. It's those sorts of what ifs that keep us from moving forward in our walk with God. And I try to unpack each of those and also how to counter them, how to counter our counter ifs with an even if declaration, and how the gospel gives us the power to do that. God's goodness as displayed to us in the cross of Jesus Christ. And I try to do it not in a trite ways of like, hey, just believe in Jesus more and you can overcome this, but rather like, what's the real, sometimes painful practices you have to do in order to declare an even if over this counter if.
Yeah. And so what are some of those what are some of those practices, because you're a pastor, I'm a pastor, and there's so many people who are watching this, and um, you just you talk to people, and they just have been through so many things, and the thought process that they can begin to adapt is I I just can't trust God because this happened to me. I don't know if God is good because this happened to me, and before we know it, our that thought pattern has just become so deeply embedded into us. It just hijacks our faith every step of the way. What
Yeah.
are some of the disciplines and practices that you have to help us build this in? We've already unpacked remembering. Do you have
Yeah.
some more?
Gratitude, right? Remembrance
Mm,
lead to gratitude, right? Um, And even if it's just grateful for small generic things to start with, like yeah, I have such a heart for that person you just described, Mark, right? Where life has just beaten them up more than any person could bear, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's a chronic pain or it's constant failure or whatever. And man, I think there's a reason why scripture's like give thanks in every circumstance. And I imagine you've probably preached on that verse so much too, right? The preposition makes all the difference there, right? Not give thanks for every circumstance, but give thanks in every circumstance.
Mm.
Gratitude, gratitude. I have a buddy. He is a on the journey of recovery from as an alcoholic and came to Christ maybe about 6 or 7 years ago, and God has just radically changed. Not even just him, but his marriage, his family tree. It's just beautiful. And he's one of the most grateful men that I know, right? And
Mm.
he is always like, he is always able to find gratitude for something, even things that don't go his way. And so I would say like that there's a first practice, like start with gratitude, right? And I'll even kind of up the stakes a little bit. Not just gratitude, like, hey, thanks for my friends, but the take it one step further, like theological gratitude, like gratitude for my friends. And what does that tell me about who God is?
Mm.
And just speak that, right? I think gratitude is a huge, huge overlooked step in this. Because if you find yourself not being able to be grateful, right? That can actually, you can actually wear down your defenses that have come up because you put up those defenses because life has been hard. Gratitude can help you kind of start wearing down those defenses. Another one that's a little bit kind of related to it, but on a slightly other side of the coin. Brian Stone calls this practice saying what is so, saying what is so,
Mm.
speaking actually that which is in your heart. The contemplatives called this naming your desires before the Lord.
Mm.
And I realized, man, I can't remember at what age that I was taught to not, that there are some things that you just aren't allowed to say out loud.
Oh yeah. Yeah,
You know
absolutely.
what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
Like, and Christians have their own like unspoken rules about this, right?
Mm.
Like, you're never allowed to in a small group or a small Sunday. You can't ever express doubt,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Right. Um, the best example is like so. As a parent of five young kids, I always show my kids the depth of my love for them every winter and spring when I go to their orchestra concerts, man. It is what I'm talking about? It is
Yeah.
a trial of endurance. Like, I've recorded a few just to remind them if they ever doubt my love for them, like, I'm going to show them this. I'm like, I sat through this because I love you. Right. Um, well, one that was particularly off key and off tune, we're listening through, and where all these parents are packed in, they got their recording devices, and my third son sitting next to me, he's growing uncomfortable. Mark, I kid you not, he says this during the piece in his outdoor voice. He says, "This is awful," right? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm mortified, right? But and so I'm looking around in panic at other, like, these parents, and you can see them chuckling, and you see some parents just nodding their heads because they're like, yes, you're right, this is awful, right? But they're not allowed to say it. They're not allowed to say it. They have internalized, where my third savage son has not internalized
Mm.
that there are some things you're not allowed to say aloud. I wonder how many of those kinds of things that we translate into our relationship with God. There are some
Mm.
things that are just off limits in our prayers, even our silent prayers. We're just not allowed to say them to God because we'll tick him off. We'll expose some divine insecurity that we imagine he might have. So we don't speak those things. We don't speak about the hard things. We don't launch our disappointments. We don't cry out to God in the sense of more than just God help, but rather God help because this thing is terrible and this situation is awful and cancer stinks and it shouldn't have its way. Uh, I think this practice of saying what is so, because when you start to say what is so, it says that you can trust God, that you can and that he can handle it.
Mm.
He can handle what we have to say. So I think that's a really, really important practice as well, of just saying what is so, our disappointments, our confusions, our hurt, to speak it out.
Yeah. And that's really close to the other practice you talk about in the book Lament, right?
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
and so what is that? I mean, you see that in the Psalms over and over, just
Yeah.
people crying out to God. And so what is lament?
It's a Godward cry, right? It's a Godward cry. It's this, it's, oh, you can almost say it's the voice of complaint about how hard the world is, how hard life is. I mean, most people don't realize this, but there are more lament psalms in the book of Psalms than there are the Hallel or the Hallelujah psalms.
Hmm.
And actually, the more I think about that, that's like actually super comforting.
Hmm.
The reason is because it means like, oh, the Bible is a book for real life because the life has always been hard. The world has always been broken and so difficult to live in. And God gives space for the voice of his beloved ones to be able to say, God, this is really difficult. How long, oh Lord? How long will you forget me forever? Right. And you could, when I remember the first time just trying to really start to study and practice lament, it felt so weird. It
Hmm.
felt almost atheistic, like I'm crying out to God. But then a friend of mine who wrote extensively on this, she helped me point out, like, but do you realize that the medium is the message? And what she meant was that you might think like, oh, this is a cry of unbelief, but the very fact that you're crying out to God, that complaint is an act of belief, right? Lament is not some like, let me scream at the top of my lungs and just empty out my heart as some kind of cathartic thing, right? Like a hard workout after a stressful day. That's not lament. Lament is a Godward cry in which we are saying, God, you're our only hope, and this is really bad. One author said it's not a return to happiness. It's not the way to happiness. It's the way to faith,
Hmm.
right? That God, I believe you're so real and I believe you're so good and the world is so broken and it's exactly as you said it is. Lord, how long? How long? How long? Right? So lament is very I mean, and we're not good at lament, right?
Oh yeah.
I mean, even in our songs, right? Just think about like the last lament song you sang in church or you heard on Shine FM, right? Like
Yeah.
and again, I'm not throwing shade at this, but we don't like lament because we don't like to name what is so,
Hmm.
right? We don't like to name it. And I think we're what it means then is we're like living our Christian faith with one arm tied behind our back because God gives us this beautiful avenue and an invitation to lament, to cry out to him, to
Hmm.
speak so, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm.
And in so many ways that hurts the church. It hurts us as followers of Jesus because, you know, one of the things I love about your book is your book, literally the passage out of Daniel. I mean, it comes right out of the fire. I mean, this book is born out of the fire of your own trials and this season of suffering. And so many times that's where faith grows,
Yes.
but we don't want to lament. We don't want to name it as it is. We want to cover it up and act like things are better.
Mhm.
And that's one of the things that just strikes me about your book is your book is simply about faith. And and that faith is confidence in who God is, and then the resolve to act on that confidence. Is that right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Right. And and it's not even that we don't want to do that. Like people around us aren't really helpful when it comes to this, right? Like when you're suffering, have you ever had that like, I'll always pray this with a family before a funeral, right? I'll always pray with them. Let's go in and let's God forgive people for what they're going to say and
Mm,
forgive people for not saying what they should have said, right? When they're meeting with people, because we're just not good at suffering. And so when you're suffering, people aren't lamenting with you. They're telling you, "Hey, Mark, here's actually why you're suffering. Right? Like you didn't do this, or you did this, or you didn't do this enough, right?
yeah.
Or oh, you know what? God's gonna take this cancer and he's gonna use it for some good, like some kind of prophetic announcement. And I want to believe this, but if we're talking about real faith, like I'm not God. I don't know why he brought this situation into your life. And the last thing I'm going to do is to number one, gloss it over and say, well, it's not that bad,
Mm,
or to somehow think I can lift you up out of this because I can't. I'm just going to sit there with you, right? And think about this in Daniel 3. Like we know that those three guys don't get burned in the fire, right? But God doesn't spare them from the fire.
Yeah.
He doesn't shut down the furnace. He could have, right? I mean, if he with Elijah, if he can make soaked wood burn, like he could shut down a really hot furnace. He could
Mm.
close the door. He doesn't. He actually allows them to be thrown in the fire. And the difference, the surprise, the turn is he is present with them in it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what even if offers us is not a pass to avoid the fire, uh, not a changing of the circumstances necessarily, though I do pray for that for people. But I pray even more so the resolve to worship God in the fire, because God will be present with you. We can say that for sure, right? Like we may not know how a situation will turn out. We may not know what's going to happen, but we can say for sure, as the promise of Scripture tells us, surely I will not neither leave you nor forsake you. God is with us. And I believe that even if that confidence and that resolve allows us to experience Him in the fire.
Yeah. That's good. That's good. Mitchell, one more question. This has been so good to talk to you. But what would you say to the person that's watching this? They're listening to this, and life hasn't gone their way. They're facing just mountains of disappointment, and they honestly, they feel like they're about to throw in the towel on their relationship with God and on their faith. What would you say to that person? How would you try to encourage them, or anything at all?
Yeah. The first is God has not abandoned you, right?
Mm.
And sure, it's easy for a guy who's written a book on that to say that, right? That God has not abandoned you. I would simply point to say, here's how I know God has not abandoned you. And it's just a simple image from the scriptures. Usually, when a person is in the suffering, um, the two questions are the why and the where, right? Why is this happening? And where is God in it? I'm not as confident and to say why. I can't. There's just too many variables in there. But I can say where God is in it, is in your suffering, whether or not you can see Him or not, right? So I'll take it to Psalm 23. Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd; I lack nothing. The Lord is my shepherd. What a beautiful picture, right? And there's a reason I think why Psalm 23 is read at funerals and hospital beds. There's something so comforting that the Lord is with us. The problem is in the suffering. It's like, well, if He's my shepherd, why can't I see Him, right? And um, so I was traveling in Israel a number of years ago, and we're in the Judean wilderness on this highway, and I'm looking out the bus, and I see this huge sprawling flock, Mark. I mean, just huge sheep and goats, gigantic thing. I'm like, oh, this is so neat. Here's the live illustration of the Lord is my shepherd. I'm looking for the shepherd, looking at the front of the flock, and I don't see the shepherd. And where's the shepherd there? Right? I'm looking some more, and I realize, oh my gosh, the shepherd's at the back. He's driving the flock from the back, from the
Mm.
rear, which is so different from all the pictures of the Lord is my shepherd that I've seen, right? You've seen them, right? Where Jesus is carrying a lamb and all the sheep are in single file line, like nicely tucked in behind him, and right, like, and we think, yeah, the shepherd's in the front, but think about the logic of that. If the shepherd's in the front, he cannot see, he's not looking at what's happening to the flock. He can't protect them. He does all he can see is the road ahead. He doesn't see the dangers and the things that are encroaching on the flock. So when I looked at this real life picture of a shepherd, the shepherd in the back, he's got some dogs, some sheep hands, but he's in the back and he's driving the flock by his voice. He can see everything that's happening and all the threats to the flock. Problem is the flock can't see him,
Mm. Yeah.
right? But he's driving them from the back. And I realize more often than not in my life, the times where I felt like, oh man, where is God? Like he's actually right there. He's driving from the back, right?
Mm.
My encouragement to somebody, listen, if you've got mountains of disappointment and you're about to throw in that towel, let's remember together. Let's remember together for a moment, where has God been good to you in the past? Right? And if that body of data is too small, let's expand it. Who has God been to the people of God in the scriptures? Right? Um, there's this one practice in the Passover Seder for Jews. There's one portion after they tell the Exodus story, Mark, they sing this song called the Dayenu. And the Dayenu in Hebrew means it would have been enough.
Mm.
And there's like 14, 15 lines that the leader of the Seder will sing. And after each line, and it's things like, if you had just heard our cry, and then they sing Daieno, it would have been enough. If you had just, given us bread, it would have been enough. Like 14 of these lines. And it's this cumulative effect of like, God, you've been already so good to us. Even while we're in the wilderness, even while we're in exile, you have been so good to us. It would have been enough. It would have been enough. It would have been enough. And my encouragement is, in your own life and in the testimony of Scripture, if you can't look at anything else, if all of that stuff is too foggy too, you can look at the cross of Christ.
Hmm.
God has been good to us at great cost to himself, right? That Jesus, actually, he himself issued an even if, right? This cup you can take from me, right? But even if you don't, I'm obeying you, Father. I'm going to go to the cross. The love of God demonstrated for us that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Right? The gospel is the ultimate even if declaration over our lives. And that would be my encouragement, is start with your own life. Look, if you don't see the remembrance there, keep widening the circle of data. And in that, you will see the goodness of God. And I pray that it gives them strength. I pray that it gives you strength to continue to endure, whether it's a whisper of even if, or it's a defiant declaration.
Hmm. Yeah. Man, that's a good word. That's a good word. Thank you so much, Mitchell. This has been great, man. This has been great, super encouraging. The book is called Even If, and what a time for it to come out. We're here where we are in North America. Hopefully, COVID is more and more in the rearview mirror, but this is a season where this book is needed, and so man, what a gift it is. And so Mitchell, where can people? The book comes out in August. You said August the 17th.
August 17th. Yep.
Yeah.
It's on all the, book distributor channels. You can go to mitchellee.com and check out some information behind the book, information about me as well. And then we'll also be, if you subscribe there, we'll be sending out some updates as the book takes shape and the launch. And we've got a number of neat kind of communal ways to draw an even if declaration together, and to give people a chance to participate and respond and raise their own even if declaration.
That's awesome. Awesome. And we'll link to all that in the show notes, as well as where you can connect with Mitchell on Twitter. And yeah, it's been great. Mitchell, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's been an honor to talk to you today.
Thank you, Mark. And I've just so appreciated the work of Churchology and stretching our thinking and encouraging our faith, and just really grateful for you and your ministry, brother.
Thanks.
Okay.
Blessings.